So the other thing that I wanted to touch on is the design of experiments. So what's the right way to design an experiment? I mean, of course, you have to know what you mean even by an experiment. But if an experiment, for example, is to start a new product line in an existing organization, let's say, for example, Dover or any other organization that, so somebody comes up with an idea. I mean, so that's the other part of experimentation and innovation is the value of ideas, of course. You want
Right.
as many ideas as possible from your team, and how to manage that, that's another process. But somebody comes up with an idea and it sounds good and it goes through and it gets to a point where you are actually looking at turning this into an experiment. What's the best way to design the experiment so that it actually leads to, I don't want to say successful, because that sometimes it could say, like positive ROI again. I don't want to say that, but how do you design the experiment so that it sets the right, expectations, and then all the way through to learn and, measure and learn.
Right. So I think there's two things that are really important in that. Number one is that you have to go into the the process of the experiment by knowing what your assumptions are. What are you assuming to be true that there is no evidence in place for yet? So what evidence do you need in order to assume that something is true and prove that out?
So would that be
So,
like the success factors or the metrics that you're going to measure against?
well, that's kind of the second piece is evaluating that. So I think there's two pieces. One is, and this is really difficult, especially in the enterprise. Enterprises are made up of experts at something. All right.
Mhm.
At Dover being a manufacturing company, we're expert at delivering manufacturing and building things, right? So, and we have certain, products that we build and we deliver to market. We do extremely successfully, and make a lot of money on them, and things are looking very good, and the stock price is great, and that leaves everybody with this feeling of we are experts at certain things, all right? But what happens is when you start doing innovation, you start wandering into things that are more uncertain, your expertise becomes a problem. It creates a cognitive bias, where it creates a series of cognitive biases, but
Right,
one of which is well known as confirmation bias. It says we are always looking for the answers that prove the way we already think, right?
right,
So step one then of the designing an experiment process is understanding what you already believe to be true because of your expert status, and then setting out to prove that it's not true.
right,
If you set out to prove that it is true, the expert confirmation bias will take over.
right, right.
There's no need, because you will always come back with the same answer you thought you would have when you went in,
Or
right?
you'll
So
probably be constantly fighting against that.
yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Or you'll be rationalizing away what you've heard.
right,
Uh, and so I kind of going back then. So step number one is we have to understand what it is that we're trying to determine whether it's true or false, because it's an assumption. We set out to prove that it's false, and then if we can't prove that it's false, then it may be true. All right, so we're going to work on that side. So understanding what your assumptions are is very, very important. And then the second piece of it is something that you then alluded to, which is what are your metrics to show that you have learned what you needed to learn.
okay,
Okay. All right. So, and those are very individualized. Now, I teach from a mentoring perspective of teams. I teach them that the metric should be tied directly to the assumption itself. They're not broad metrics, they're specific,
right,
and they last only as long as that assumption lasts. Okay. And then you need to set more. Now, this becomes a really difficult thing because people don't like to continually reset metrics, but I think we get off very so for instance, let me use this one. I had a friend of mine one time that told me, I asked him about what kind of success metrics are you using in your innovation program, and he started talking about, well, one of our success metrics is the number of experiments that we run. I'm like, well, it's not the number of experiments that you're running in my mind, right?
hmm,
Because what that leads to is people wanting to cycle time experiences as much as possible in order to hit a number goal
right,
as opposed to a learning goal, right?
right,
So The metrics themselves then in part two have to be tied to what you're trying to learn. All right. Let me give you an example.
Okay.
I had a team I was working with one time. They had this great idea for, and we won't go into it, but they had a great idea for cruise lines. And they were gonna pitch this to the cruise lines because this was going to make the passengers really, really happy. And believe it or not, I think it actually had some merit at the time. It was really kind of interesting. All right. So I'm like, okay, well, you've worked up your value proposition, your solution statement. You know kind of what it is that you think. You've got some assumptions about what you think the passengers would think and whatnot. Okay. So, and we came to the point says, okay, well, their next step was to find out, some of whether their value proposition resonated with the cruise lines. Okay. So what type of metric do you put in place to find that out? Well, they were thinking about, oh, okay, we'll do a survey, we'll do this, we'll do that, blah 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 blah. I'm like, no, 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 no. Wait a minute. You're getting way too far ahead of yourself. The first validation of the metric of your idea is, will they even give you a meeting? If you
Mm.
can't pitch them something that will enable you to give them a meeting, whether it's either a phone call or a face-to-face. So you've got 5 target cruise lines that do the Mediterranean that you really would like to talk to. If you can't get one of those to give you a meeting, either face-to-face or on the phone, within the next 14 days, 2 weeks,
Right.
your idea is dead. Or you got to pivot your value proposition because it's not meaningful enough for them to care, right?
That's very important. If I may cut in, it brings the differentiation between product experimentation and business experimentation. You're thinking about this is a business experiment. They're thinking about it's a product experiment.
That's right.